John Wesley was an Anglican cleric and theologian who, with his brother Charles and fellow cleric George Whitefield, is credited with the foundation of Methodism. His work and writings also played a leading role in the development of the Holiness movement and Pentecostalism. Educated at Charterhouse School and Oxford University, Wesley was elected a Fellow of Lincoln College, Oxford in 1726 and ordained a priest 2 years later. Returning to Oxford in 1729 after serving as curate at his father's parish, he led the Holy Club, a society formed for the purpose of study and the pursuit of a devout Christian life. It had been founded by his brother Charles, and counted George Whitefield among its members. After an unsuccessful ministry of 2 years at Savannah in the Georgia colony, Wesley returned to London and joined a religious society led by Moravian Christians. On the 24th of May 1738 he experienced what has come to be called his evangelical conversion, when he felt his heart strangely warmed. He subsequently departed from the Moravians, beginning his own ministry. A key step in the development of Wesley's ministry was, like Whitefield, to travel and preach outdoors. In contrast to Whitefield's Calvinism, Wesley embraced the Arminian doctrines that dominated the Church of England at the time. Moving across Great Britain and Ireland, he helped form and organize small Christian groups that developed intensive and personal accountability, discipleship and religious instruction. Most importantly, he appointed itinerant, unordained evangelists to travel and preach as he did and to care for these groups of people. Under Wesley's direction, Methodists became leaders in many social issues of the day, including prison reform and the abolition of slavery. Although he was not a systematic theologian, Wesley argued for the notion of Christian perfection and against Calvinism, and, in particular, against its doctrine of predestination. He held that, in this life, Christians could achieve a state where the love of God reigned supreme in their hearts, giving them outward holiness. His evangelicalism, firmly grounded in sacramental theology, maintained that means of grace were the manner by which God sanctifies and transforms the believer, encouraging people to experience Jesus Christ personally. Throughout his life, Wesley remained within the established Anglican Church, insisting that the Methodist movement lay well within its tradition. Although sometimes maverick in his interpretation and use of church policy, he became widely respected and, by the end of his life, had been described as the best-loved man in England. Early life. John Wesley was born in 1703 in Epworth, 23 miles northwest of Lincoln, as the 15th child of Samuel Wesley and his wife Susanna Wesley. Samuel Wesley was a graduate of the University of Oxford and a poet who, from 1696, was rector of Epworth. He married Susanna, the 25th child of Samuel Annesley, a dissenting minister, in 1689. Ultimately, she bore him 19 children, of which 9 lived beyond infancy. She and Samuel Wesley had become members of the Church of England as young adults. As in many families at the time, Wesley's parents gave their children their early education. Each child, including the girls, was taught to read as soon as they could walk and talk. They were expected to become proficient in Latin and Greek and to have learned major portions of the New Testament by heart. Susanna Wesley examined each child before the midday meal and before evening prayers. Children were not allowed to eat between meals and were interviewed singularly by the mother one evening each week for the purpose of intensive spiritual instruction. In 1714, at age 11, Wesley was sent to the Charterhouse School in London, where he lived the studious, methodical and, for a while, religious life in which he had been trained at home. Apart from his disciplined upbringing, a rectory fire which occurred on the 9th of February 1709, when Wesley was 5 years old, left an indelible impression. Some time after 11 o'clock p.m., the rectory roof caught on fire. Sparks falling on the children's beds and cries of "fire" from the street roused the Wesleys, who managed to shepherd all their children out of the house except for John, who was left stranded on the second floor, with stairs aflame and the roof about to collapse. Wesley was lifted out of the second-floor window by a parishioner standing on another man's shoulders. Wesley later utilized the phrase, "a brand plucked out of the fire," quoting Zechariah chapter 3 verse 2, to describe the incident. This childhood deliverance subsequently became part of the Wesley legend, attesting to his special destiny and extraordinary work. Education. In June 1720, Wesley entered Christ Church, Oxford. In 1724, he graduated as a Bachelor of Arts and decided to pursue a Master of Arts degree. He was ordained a deacon on the 25th of September 1725, holy orders being a necessary step toward becoming a fellow and tutor at the university. In the year of his ordination he read Thomas à Kempis and Jeremy Taylor, and began to seek the religious truths which underlay the great revival of the 18th century. The reading of Law's Christian Perfection and a serious call to a devout and holy life gave him, he said, a sublimer view of the law of God, and he resolved to keep it, inwardly and outwardly, as sacredly as possible. Believing that in obedience he would find salvation, he pursued a rigidly methodical and abstemious life, studied the Scriptures, and performed his religious duties diligently, depriving himself so that he would have alms to give. He began to seek after holiness of heart and life. In March 1726, Wesley was unanimously elected a Fellow of Lincoln College, Oxford. This carried with it the right to a room at the college and regular salary. While continuing his studies, he taught Greek, lectured on the New Testament and moderated daily disputations at the university. However, a call to ministry intruded upon his academic career. In August 1727, after taking his master's degree, Wesley returned to Epworth. His father had requested his assistance in serving the neighboring cure of Reuter. Ordained a priest on the 22nd of September 1728, Wesley served as a parish curate for 2 years. He returned to Oxford in November 1729 at the request of the rector of Lincoln College and to maintain his status as junior fellow. Holy Club. During Wesley's absence, his younger brother Charles matriculated at Christ Church. Along with 2 fellow students, he formed a small club for the purpose of study and the pursuit of a devout Christian life. On Wesley's return, he became the leader of the group, which increased somewhat in number and greatly in commitment. The group met daily from 6 until 9 for prayer, psalms, and reading of the Greek New Testament. They prayed every waking hour for several minutes on each day for a special virtue. While the church's prescribed attendance was only 3 times a year, they took communion every Sunday. They fasted on Wednesdays and Fridays until 3 o'clock, as was commonly observed in the ancient church. In 1730, the group began the practice of visiting prisoners in jail. They preached, educated, and relieved jail debtors whenever possible, and cared for the sick. Given the low ebb of spirituality in Oxford at the time, it was not surprising that Wesley's group provoked a negative reaction. They were considered to be religious enthusiasts, which in the context of the time meant religious fanatics. University would style them the Holy Club, a title level of derision. Currents of opposition became a furore following the mental breakdown and death of a group member, William Morgan, in response to the charge that rigorous fasting had hastened his death. Wesley noted that Morgan had left off fasting a year and a half since. In the same letter, which was widely circulated, Wesley referred to the name Methodist, which some of our neighbors are pleased to compliment us. Quote, "The name was used by an anonymous author in a published pamphlet describing Wesley and his group, the Oxford Methodists. For all of his outward piety, Wesley sought to cultivate his inner holiness, or at least his sincerity, as evidence of being a true Christian. A list of general questions, which he developed in 1730, evolved into an elaborate grid by 1734, in which he recorded his daily activities, hour by hour. Resolutions he had broken or kept, and ranked his hourly temper of devotion on a scale of 1 to 9. Wesley also regarded the contempt with which he and his group were held to be a mark of a true Christian. As he put it in a letter to his father, "Till he be thus contemned, no man is in a state of salvation." Journey to Savannah, Georgia. On the 14th of October 1735, Wesley and his brother Charles sailed on the Simmons from Gravesend in Kent for Savannah in the province of Georgia in the American colonies at the request of James Oglethorpe, who had founded the colony in 1733 on behalf of the trustees for the establishment of the colony of Georgia in America. Oglethorpe wanted Wesley to be the minister of the newly formed Savannah parish, a new town laid out in accordance with the famous Oglethorpe Plan. It was on the voyage to the colonies that the Wesleys first came into contact with Moravian settlers. Wesley was influenced by the deep faith and spirituality rooted in pietism. At one point in the voyage, a storm came up and broke the mast off the ship. While the English panicked, the Moravians calmly sang hymns and prayed. This experience led Wesley to believe that the Moravians possessed an inner strength which he lacked. The deeply personal religion that the Moravian pietists practiced heavily influenced Wesley's theology of Methodism. Wesley arrived in the colony in February 1736. He approached the Georgia mission as a high churchman, seeing it as an opportunity to revive primitive Christianity in a primitive environment. Although his primary goal was to evangelize the Native Americans, a shortage of clergy in the colony largely limited his ministry to European settlers in Savannah. While his ministry has often been judged to have been a failure in comparison to his later success as a leader in the evangelical revival, Wesley gathered around him a group of devoted Christians who met in a number of small group religious societies. At the same time, attendance at church services and communion increased over the course of nearly 2 years in which he served as Savannah's parish priest. Nonetheless, Wesley's high church ministry was controversial amongst the colonists, and it ended in disappointment after Wesley fell in love with a young woman named Sophia Hopkey. Following her marriage to William Williamson, Wesley believed Sophia's former zeal for practicing the Christian faith declined. In strictly applying the rubrics of the Book of Common Prayer, Wesley denied her communion after she failed to signify to him in advance her intention of taking it. As a result, legal proceedings against him ensued in which a clear resolution seemed unlikely. In December 1737, Wesley fled the colony and returned to England. It has been widely recognized that one of the most significant accomplishments of Wesley's Georgia mission was his publication of a collection of psalms and hymns. The collection was the first Anglican hymnal published in America, and the first of many hymn books Wesley published. It included 5 hymns he translated from German. Wesley's Aldersgate experience. Wesley returned to England depressed and beaten. It was at this point that he turned to the Moravians. Both he and Charles received counsel from the young Moravian missionary Peter Bowler, who was temporarily in England awaiting permission to depart for Georgia himself. Wesley's noted Aldersgate experience of the 24th of May 1738 at a Moravian meeting in Aldersgate Street, London, in which he heard a reading of Martin Luther's preface to the Epistle to the Romans, revolutionized the character and method of his ministry. The previous week he had been highly impressed by the sermon of John Halen, whom he was assisting in the service at St. Mary le Strand. Earlier that day, he had heard the choir at St. Paul's Cathedral singing Psalm chapter 130, where the psalmist calls to God out of the depths. But it was still a depressed Wesley who attended a service on the evening of the 24th of May. Wesley recounted his Aldersgate experience in his journal. In the evening I went very unwillingly to a society in Aldersgate Street, where one was reading Luther's preface to the Epistle to the Romans. About 9:15, while he was describing the change which God works in the heart through faith in Christ, I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ alone for salvation, and an assurance was given me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death. A few weeks later, Wesley preached a sermon on the doctrine of personal salvation by faith, which was followed by another, on God's grace, free in all, and free for all. Daniel L. Burnett writes, the significance of Wesley's Aldersgate experience is monumental. It is the pivotal point in his life and the Methodist movement. Without it, the names of Wesley and Methodism would likely be nothing more than obscure footnotes in the pages of church history. Daniel L. Burnett calls this event Wesley's evangelical conversion. It is commemorated in Methodist churches as Aldersgate Day. After Aldersgate, working with the Moravians, Wesley allied himself with the Moravian Society in Fetter Lane. In 1738 he went to Herrnhut, the Moravian headquarters in Germany, to study. On his return to England, Wesley drew up rules for the bands into which the Fetter Lane Society was divided and published a collection of hymns for them. He met frequently with this and other religious societies in London but did not preach often in 1738, because most of the parish churches were closed to him. Wesley's Oxford friend, the evangelist George Whitefield, was also excluded from the churches of Bristol upon his return from America. Going to the neighbouring village of Kingswood, in February 1739, Whitefield preached in the open air to a company of miners. Later he preached in Whitefield's tabernacle. Wesley hesitated to accept Whitefield's call to copy this bold step. Overcoming his scruples, he preached the first time at Whitefield's invitation sermon in the open air, near Bristol, in April 1739. Wesley wrote, I could scarce reconcile myself to this strange way of preaching in the fields, of which he set me an example on Sunday, having been all my life till very lately so tenacious of every point relating to decency and order, that I should have thought the saving of souls almost a sin if it had not been done in a church. Wesley was unhappy about the idea of field preaching, as he believed Anglican liturgy had much to offer in its practice. Earlier in his life he would have thought that such a method of saving souls was almost a sin. Quote, he recognized the open-air services were successful in reaching men and women who would not enter most churches. From then on he took the opportunities to preach wherever an assembly could be brought together, more than once using his father's tombstone at Epworth as a pulpit. Wesley continued for 50 years entering churches when he was invited, and taking his stand in the fields, in halls, cottages, and chapels, when the churches would not receive him. Late in 1739 Wesley broke with the Moravians in London. Wesley had helped them organize the Fetter Lane Society, and those converted by his preaching and that of his brother and Whitefield had become members of the bands, but he believed they fell into heresy by supporting Quietism, so he decided to form his own followers into a separate society. Thus, he wrote, without any previous plan, began the Methodist Society in England. Quote, he soon formed similar societies in Bristol and Kingswood, and wherever Wesley and his friends made converts. Persecutions and lay preaching. From 1739 onward, Wesley and the Methodists were persecuted by clergy and magistrates for various reasons. Though Wesley had been ordained an Anglican priest, many other Methodist leaders had not received ordination, and for his own part, Wesley flouted many regulations of the Church of England concerning parish boundaries and who had authority to preach. This was seen as a social threat that disregarded institutions. Clergy attacked them in sermons and in print, and at times mobs attacked them. Wesley and his followers continued to work among the neglected and needy. They were denounced as promulgators of strange doctrines, fomenters of religious disturbances, as blind fanatics, leading people astray, claiming miraculous gifts, attacking the clergy of the Church of England, and trying to re-establish Catholicism. Wesley felt that the Church failed to call sinners to repentance, that many of the clergy were corrupt, and that people were perishing in the sins. He believed he was commissioned by God to bring about revival in the Church, and no opposition, persecution, or obstacles could prevail against the divine urgency and authority of this commission. The prejudices of his high church training, his strict notions of the methods and proprieties of public worship, his views of the apostolic succession and the prerogatives of the priests, even his most cherished convictions, were not allowed to stand in the way. Unwilling that people should perish in the sins and unable to reach them from church pulpits, following the example set by George Whitefield, Wesley began field preaching. Seeing that he and the few clergy cooperating with him could not do the work that needed to be done, he was led, as early as 1739, to approve local preachers. He evaluated and approved men who were not ordained by the Anglican Church to preach and do pastoral work. This expansion of lay preachers was one of the keys of the growth of Methodism. Chapels and organizations. His societies needed houses to worship in. Wesley began to provide chapels, first in Bristol at the New Room, then in London and elsewhere. The Foundry was an early chapel utilized by Wesley. The location of the Foundry is shown on an 18th-century map, where it rests between Tabernacle Street and Worship Street in the Moorfields area of London. When the Wesleys spotted the building atop Windmill Hill, north of Finsbury Fields, the structure, which previously cast brass guns and mortars for the Royal Ordnance, had been sitting vacant for 23 years. It has been abandoned because of an explosion on the 10th of May 1716. The Bristol chapel was at first in the hands of trustees. A large debt was contracted, and Wesley's friends urged him to keep it under his own control, so the deed was cancelled and he became sole trustee. Following this precedent, all Methodist chapels were committed in trust to him until by a deed of declaration, all his interests in them were transferred to a body of preachers called the Legal 100. When disorder arose among some members of the societies, Wesley adopted giving tickets to members, with their names written by his own hand. These were renewed every 3 months. Those deemed unworthy did not receive new tickets and dropped out of the society without disturbance. The tickets were regarded as commendatory letters. When the debt on a chapel became a burden, it was proposed that 1 in 12 members should collect offerings regularly from the 11 allotted to him. Out of this grew the Methodist class meeting system in 1742. In order to keep the disorderly out of the societies, Wesley established a probationary system. He undertook to visit each society regularly in what became the quarterly visitation, or conference. As the number of societies increased, Wesley could not keep personal contact, so in 1743 he drew up a set of general rules for the United Societies. These were the nucleus of the Methodist discipline, still the basis. Over time, a shifting pattern of societies, circuits, quarterly meetings, annual conferences, classes, bands, and select societies took shape. At the local level, there were numerous societies of different sizes which were grouped into circuits to which traveling preachers were appointed for 2-year periods. Circuit officials met quarterly under a senior traveling preacher or assistant. Conferences with Wesley, traveling preachers and others were convened annually for the purpose of coordinating doctrine and discipline for the entire connection. Classes of a dozen of society members under a leader met weekly for spiritual fellowship and guidance. In early years, there were bands of the spiritually gifted who consciously pursued perfection. Those who were regarded to have achieved it were grouped in select societies of bands. In 1744, there were 77 such members. There also was a category of penitents which consisted of backsliders. As the number of preachers and preaching places increased, doctrinal and administrative matters needed to be discussed. Sir John and Charles Wesley, along with 4 other clergy and 4 lay preachers, met for consultation in London in 1744. This was the first Methodist conference. Subsequently, the conference became the ruling body of the Methodist movement. 2 years later, to help preachers work more systematically and societies receive services more regularly, Wesley appointed helpers to definitive circuits. Each circuit included at least 30 appointments a month. Believing that the preacher's efficiency was promoted by his being changed from one circuit to another every year or two, Wesley established the itinerancy and insisted that his preachers submit to its rules.